Great. Thank you so much.
So this book that I'm writing this article for is a book that I'm co-editing, and it's titled "We're Leaving, but Before We Go: Love Letters to Younger Activists." So let me just click something. Um, so the purpose of the book is to leave some breadcrumbs behind from older activists to younger ones. And I am a co-editor of the book, and my article will be one of the last two pieces to be turned in, which is difficult. Um, and my article is some thoughts about organizing. So this is just the first few paragraphs, but it kind of introduces me to you perhaps in a different way. Like many longtime organizers, I started early. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, during the last years of legal segregation. Although my family did all they could to protect my sister and me, there was no way they could completely shield us from the pervasive and painful realities of life under Jim Crow. Because of this, my political consciousness started developing before I ever participated in a protest. The fact that everyone in my family was from rural Georgia and had been born during the post-Reconstruction period of the late 1800s or during the height of Jim Crow in the early 20th century meant that even though I was born in the North, I was immersed in the knowledge, values, and folkways of African Americans who had experienced U.S. domestic terrorism firsthand. Growing up during the civil rights movement also provided a political education enhanced by the new medium of television. I know it's so hard to believe that TV was ever new, but during my childhood and growing up years, it was still new. We had three channels. Most people, well, a lot of people could not afford a TV even, but we had a black and white TV. It sat on the floor. It was what they call a floor model. That means it looked like a piece of furniture with the TV tube, embedded at the top, of this beautiful piece of furniture. And as I said, it was black and white. The screen was small. I know. I sound like I'm delusional, but it happened. Go to a museum, you can see it. But anyway, as I said, I'll just start that paragraph again. Growing up during the civil rights movement also provided a political education enhanced by the new medium of television. I got to see the movement unfold night after night on a small black and white screen in my living room, while simultaneously getting to hear and feel my family's responses to the dramatic, often violent events happening in the place they called home. I went to my first protest in April 1964. It was organized by local activists specifically for young people on the Saturday before a citywide boycott to challenge de facto segregation in the city schools. I was immediately hooked. I had never felt anything like that before. Adults actually wanted to hear what we had to say. People were telling the truth about things that were real and important. From that day on, I found every opportunity I could to participate in the movement until I went to college a year later. My sister and I became regular volunteers at the CORE office. CORE is the Congress of Racial Equality. And as I have found out through research in more recent years, it was considered to probably be the most left of the civil rights organizations. It was also based in the North. And the other one that would have that designation of being a more left organization was SNCC. I already knew how to type, but that was where I learned to cut a stencil and use a mimeograph machine. More importantly, I got to work with Ruth Turner, the phenomenal executive director of Cleveland CORE. I saw Black women's leadership up close. On one unforgettable night, I even got to hear Fannie Lou Hamer speak and talk with her in person. So that's kind of my background. Sometimes people, asked me if my family were activists, and my sister and I find that a really amusing and not relevant question, because what people in my family did was work and raise us and go to church and take care of the house and do all the things. But they were what I always describe, and most of the people that I grew up were indeed assigned female at birth. Um, they were what was called during that era race women. They were race women. And there was a concept, of course, of a race man. That meant that that was a Black person who had a clear understanding of the systemic oppression under which our community lived, and also had a consciousness that was communal about the well-being and safety and all the things for the entire race. In other words, being a race man or a race woman meant you were not individualistic in your thinking. You were thinking about the race. And more than 60 years later, I am still organizing, I guess, including today. So I'm going to start by talking about the status of Black women and the general status of Black women in the United States. I'm going to read from Kianga's introduction to the second edition of How We Get Free. If you're interested in getting the book, and the bookstores may still have the first edition, I suggest you get the new edition so you can read the new preface. There's also a new interview included in the book with Angela Davis. Might say more about that subsequently. And I'm going to clear my throat again, which is ridiculous. That's the way it is. Although I don't have asthma attacks, I do have asthma, and I use an inhaler twice a day. And I guess it was my allergist who told me, well, your inhaler actually causes you to be hoarse. I said, oh, okay. It's kind of funny, well, of course, we know that often the cure is worse than the illness. So this is just a short section. One of the things that Kianga does in the introduction, the introduction to the second edition, is that she does a really good summary of what was Black women's situation and status, material conditions of Black women, like through the sweep from kidnapping for the purpose of enslavement to the mid-20th century, when Black feminism began to emerge. So that's what she does. For me, I'm very familiar with that history, but if you're not familiar with that history, that's another reason to read and get this edition of the book, because it will definitely hit the major points about that history if you're curious to know more about that. So this is, as I said, just a sampling of the kind of both analysis and storytelling about history that she's doing in this introduction. The demand for Black women's labor raised specific challenges rooted in differing constructs that idealized white women as fragile, servile, maternal, and subordinate to men, consigned to the private sphere of home. This narrative made little sense for Black women, whose value when enslaved was determined entirely by their capacity to work, often as hard as enslaved men. There were no dispensations for Black women as far as physical labor, and that included pregnant Black women and Black women in labor. Black women often, when they were soon to have their child, were in the fields or working. I was looking at one of my history books just last week, and there was a cradle carved out of wood that showed it was a field cradle for Black infants. So, as I said, no dispensations for Black women. This narrative made little sense for Black women whose value when enslaved was determined entirely by their capacity to work, often as hard as enslaved men. As one report noted, quote, in their pre-Civil War status, it was the ability of Negro women to work that governed their market value. At the close of the Civil War, a large proportion of all Negro women, married as well as single, were forced to engage in breadwinning activities, end quote. Black women were expected to work and were also relentlessly victimized by unwanted sexual attention and sexual assault. Also, a continuity from slavery. One of the reasons that Black families, poor Black families in the South, often work very hard to get their daughters to college, or at least through high school, which was not the usual. I mean, most people in the country during a certain period didn't even finish high school. But as I said, the reason that Black families would work really hard to get their daughters an education is so they did not have to go into white homes and be sexually abused / raped. So that's, if you just look at the demographics, there's a perspective like, oh yeah, Black women are so much better off than Black men, and they have a higher level of college attendance and graduation, etc. That may well be true. I don't know what the statistics look like now, but there was a point at which that was a protective intervention so that they could protect their children, their daughters from sexual abuse. To go on reading from Kianga's introduction, Black women's experiences then were shaped not only by race, but also by gender and their status as workers. In the early 1960s, Pauli Murray described Black women as, quote, triply handicapped, end quote, largely concentrated in non-union employment, imperiled by her race and gender, and undermined by inadequate education and training. Murray was articulating a long-standing recognition of the condition feeding Black women's political consciousness. What would come to be described as Black feminist consciousness was not new to the 1960s. Nearly 100 years earlier, in 1861, Harriet Jacobs wrote an Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, quote, slavery is terrible for men, but it is far more terrible for women. Superadded to the burden common to all, they have wrongs and sufferings and mortifications peculiarly their own, end quote. Note the elliptic language, the indirect description of what I just said to you outright. That's how a Black woman who had been enslaved in the 1800s wrote about that ongoing phenomenon, because it continued after slavery as well. This is just one example of the widespread understanding within communities of enslaved people that the experiences of Black women were distinct from the men they worked alongside, and the white women they worked in subordination to. Those distinctions survived enslavement and would go on to undermine the meaning of freedom for Black women and their families. I will let you know that when I first became aware of the second wave of the women's movement, when I was a senior in college, that was 1968 to 1969. I graduated in 1969. When I first became aware that there was something called a women's movement, and I met my first person who identified as a part of women's liberation, I could not even compute it. I could not put it together, because what my perspective was, white women have been, terrorizing and hounding and exploiting and abusing Black women all their lives, and they generally get to sit at home, and be taken care of by that white male salary, or in the case of, the period, the antebellum period, the long antebellum period that lasted hundreds of years, they got to sit at home and, a profit from the labor of the people that they enslaved. But whatever that was, it was like, I don't really get this. It didn't take me long to figure out some of the things that were going on, because I went to grad school right after college. And when I wanted to purchase a typewriter, an electric portable typewriter, which was state of the art at the time. It was 1969. I went to J.C. Penney, and they would not allow me to purchase a typewriter with a payment plan because I wasn't married to anybody. And the way I got my typewriter is that my dear aunt, who raised my sister and me after our mother died at a very young age, I asked would she charge it, and then I would pay her. Absurd, right? But you are looking at somebody who could not get credit in their own name to do something called grad school in English at the University of Pittsburgh. That happened at when I was at the University of Pittsburgh. So to continue, now I'm going to talk about the political environment in which late 20th century Black feminism arose. In 1973, my sister and I attended the first Eastern Regional Conference, and I'll repeat that, the first Eastern Regional Conference of the National Black Feminist Organization, which was held in New York City. By that time, my sister and I, we did not live in the same place. I lived in Boston. But by that time, my sister and I were definitely interested in feminism. In the fall of 1973, I was teaching my first class in Black women's literature, and Beverly was working at Ms. Magazine. So clearly, we were two Black women who had an interest in what's this thing that's going on. Beverly went to some National Organization of Women's meetings. That's now the organization now. I never went to or got involved in any white women's political organizations. I was in a consciousness raising group, but that's another, that was not a political consciousness raising group per se. It was in another context. But we were interested. We just weren't seeing anything that reflected what we were concerned about or what we experienced as Black women. Beverly found out about the National Black Feminist Organizations and about the conference referred to as NBFO. And of course, with great excitement, we both attended. There were incredible luminaries of our political movement at that time, including Eleanor Holmes Norton, Shirley Chisholm, the poet June Jordan, the writer and poet Alice Walker, the incredible visual artist Faith Ringgold, and her daughter Michelle Wallace. There were lots of people at this thing, and although it was a regional, defined as an Eastern regional conference, people came from all over the country. There were several hundred women there. Those of us who were at the conference were charged with going back to our respective home places that we resided and to start a chapter. So we started doing that in Boston. So originally the Combahee River Collective was a chapter of the National Black Feminist Organization. We decided rather soon to become an independent organization. It was very hard for NBFO to function as a national organization because unlike now, which was never like rolling in dough, but that differential of white privilege that can translate into class privilege, not always, but as we know, sometimes Black women did not have that as a fallback for starting something that generated no income, namely, a social justice organization. So we were not particularly satisfied with what we were getting from NBFO. And also we were realizing that our politics were different from NBFO, specifically around socialism and anti-capitalism. Before Combahee became organized, there was SNCC, and of course, at our last session, you found out and heard about SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which functioned mostly in the South. It included some people from the North, but its turf, so to speak, was in the former or either present Confederacy. I'm not sure the Confederacy ever actually ended, but certainly doesn't seem like it ended now because it's in the White House, And why is the place, the seat of government, the executive branch, in a white supremacist country called the White House? You ever think about that? I do. It was also built by enslaved Black people. So, you couldn't make this stuff up. You really couldn't. It's like, oh, like that's a really clever script for a movie. We'll have this really racist country, and the seat of government we call the White House, and we'll have it be, constructed by enslaved people. And people say, yeah, that should make a lot of money. That's a really interesting, concept. Anyway, that's what happened. You live here. You live here. We all do. Um, as I said before, Combahee, women in SNCC, women in the movement to end the war in Vietnam. Um, People were looking at the situation with the male left, and they were thinking, this is not working. This is not working for us. There are things that are happening to us in the context of fighting for liberation that don't really track. And there's some very painful history of Black women who were in SNCC, which to me was the leading, grassroots civil rights organization of the time, unlike, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was, male-led and also, kind of Christian. Well, it had it in its title, Christian, more, like more mainstream. Definitely the NAACP was more mainstream. But there's some, as I said, very, very brutal and painful stories about Black women experiencing sexual abuse in the context of being involved in that kind of grassroots organizing in SNCC. A group that predated the NBFO and the Combahee River Collective was the Third World Women's Alliance. If you're interested in delving into the history of where did all this come from, how did all this start, you should definitely find out about the Third World Women's Alliance. It was a leftist, Black and other women of color led organization. I think they grappled with, were they going to include Latina or Latinx women? They did. The name that is most often associated, a visible name that is associated with the Third World Women's Alliance is Frances Beale. There is a person in Combahee who was older than the rest of us. We were in our 20s and early 30s. This person, whose name is Sharon Burke, was in her early 40s, and she had an extensive history in the Black left, including having worked at the Institute of the Black World in Atlanta. Another thing for you to look up if you want to delve into the history of that period, the Institute of the Black World. She certainly helped shape our politics, and she was friends with Frances Beale. So we actually saw, copies of their newspaper, which is called Triple Jeopardy. One of the things that, well, maybe I should, I'll just say it right now. One of the things they did not incorporate into their political analysis was the reality of the oppression of people who were not heterosexual, not cisgendered, etc. They did not include that. I'm going to read to you now. I'm going to read to you now from the Combahee River Collective statement. At least I think I am. It's in a couple of these books I have beside me. I'm going to read about the concept that some people would refer to as intersectionality or intersectional. But this is a core distillation of what Combahee stood for. And I assume that you have read the statement probably even before you got involved in this study group. But I'm just going to share that with you now so you'll have it in mind. This is from the first paragraph of the Combahee River Collective statement. We wrote it in 1977. Think about that. Next year will be the 50th anniversary of the Combahee River Collective statement. Who knew? I mean, we never knew it was going to blow up like it did, and it hasn't, there's still a lot of people who are struggling in the wilderness. They are not aware. I shouldn't say it like that, but I did say it like that. They are still struggling in the wilderness because they have not yet gotten the word, you know. But it has gone far and wide. It absolutely has gone far and wide. So we said the most general statement of our politics at the present time would be that we are actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and see as our particular task the development of an integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking. The synthesis of these oppressions creates the conditions of our lives. As Black women, we see Black feminism as the logical political movement to combat the manifold simultaneous oppressions that all women of color face. And as I said, that's a distillation of the whole statement, really. And I wrote for my junior high school newspaper and my high school newspaper, which was a nationally award-winning high school newspaper. I was the editorial page editor for a couple of years. That included the arts coverage as well as the editorials. And I ate and drank and lived journalism because it was the only outlet for writing at my high school. We did not have a literary magazine. But one of the things about journalism, and I was just thinking about this morning because of something I had sent to our JVP chapter yesterday about headlines in all caps and why you need not be so, you need not diss all caps because they were for headlines. Like I was thinking about how not only is a headline supposed to give you the like sense of what the whole story is, even if you never read any further than the headline, the first paragraph is supposed to do the same thing. And look at this. I just read to you from the first paragraph of the Combahee River Collective Statement, and it basically just lays it out. So sorry, I'll apologize for being hoarse probably throughout because I'm going to be hoarse throughout. So now I'm going to talk about, just a second, I'm going to drink some water if you don't mind. Now I'm going to talk about the unique ideological contributions that Combahee made. The first is there is the our assertion that Black women experienced oppression based upon gender, or as it would have been said at the time, that we experienced sexism as well as racism and class oppression. So that was a unique ideological contribution of the practice of Combahee and the analysis of Combahee. Another thing that was really new and genuine, because lip service is always given to like, oh yeah, we like you, but you're okay, but so it's not like no one had ever said that Black women were wonderful before. They did, and they did. It wasn't that it was ungenuine. It's just that it was Black women in a certain frame. So Black church women. Did you know that Black churches were having women's days once a year, long before there was a women's movement? We had an annual, and not just us, like it was a Black thing. We always had a Women's Day at our church, and that was a day that women were honored. And Black women generally didn't, I don't remember a Black woman ever preaching, standing behind, the pulpit or at the pulpit. But they might say a few words, and they'd be recognized, very Southern, although it was all happening in the North. I mean, it's very accurate that virtually everybody in my church, and it was a huge church and considered to be the most prominent Black church in Cleveland at the time. I did not know that. All I knew is that I was bored and hungry. But the thing is that every single member of that church, with almost without exception, would have had roots in the South. So, that whole Southern, upbringing, that I didn't really have, because I didn't live down there, thank goodness, because I think my heart would have been broken and my spirit would have been crushed to live in the last years of segregation in the U.S. Confederate South. But as I said, as far as the culture was concerned, dead up, dead up. So there are things that people say in Black churches, like instead of saying we're going to Ms. So and so, or in those days it would be Mrs. or Miss so and so is now going to sing a solo. What they would say is Miss Gaunt. That's a Black woman who lives here, who's a musicologist and has a beautiful voice. Miss Gaunt will now favor us with a selection. That's how you say it. I mean, it's just like that's how you say it. She will favor us with a selection. Speaking of which, one day, Coretta Scott King came to our church to do a recital because she was a highly talented, classically trained singer. She and Martin Luther King met when she was at Boston, maybe it's the New England Conservatory of Music. There are a couple of conservatories in Boston, but she was studying, classical, voice, and he was at Boston University working on his PhD in theology, I guess. That's when they met. But anyway, one day, as I said, Coretta Scott King came to our church and gave a concert. And of course, that meant and it was on a Sunday, that meant we had to go to church twice that day. And like Beverly and I, my sister and I, of course, did not want to go. We were ignorant. We were ignorant when we were growing up. We were ignorant. And as I mean, a lot of people wouldn't say that children are ignorant, but you met children and you were a child yourself. There are a lot of things you did not understand. Thank God they dragged us to see Coretta Scott King sing in person. But that's a digression. I'm just talking about my culture. But I was raised, to make a point, I was raised in a culture of Black women having agency. So, we didn't need a women's movement for that. Every Black woman in my family either had worked or was working. Most of the people in our neighborhood, those women and mothers, the mothers of our friends, they worked as well. There was no concept of you're never going to have to work. There was no concept. It was like, yeah, you will be working. And the question is, what kind of work will you be doing? So anyway, one of the things that we did in the Combahee River Collective was to genuinely assert that Black women had inherent value. This was absolutely up for debate, not just in the larger racial capitalist society of the United States, but even more painfully in the Black liberation movement. And that's pitiful. These two concepts that Black women were worthy of freedom and that we experience multiple vectors of systemic oppression were capsulized in the term identity politics. This term appeared for the first time in the Combahee River Collective Statement. That is the first time on Earth. As you know, long before you could Google or search for something online, I've spoken on countless college and university campuses during my career. And I would often ask my colleagues, who I would meet, and I might be meeting them for the first time. I would always ask, have you ever seen it anywhere else? Have you ever seen identity politics anywhere else? It's not really anywhere else. It's in the Combahee River Collective Statement. This term appeared for the first time in the Combahee River Collective Statement. As you know, the concept of identity politics has had a very troubled history. It has been distorted, misused, and abused. What we meant is that given our identities as Black women, who were simultaneously targeted by multiple major systems of oppression, we logically had a right to develop political agendas that addressed our actual material conditions and situation. And I'm going to paraphrase that and say it again. All we meant that if we were experiencing these different kinds and levels of oppression, discrimination, bigotry, marginalization, etc., that we actually had the right to come up with solutions for that. In other words, to build a politics based upon the components of our identity. It didn't mean that we thought everybody else was trash. We did not think that. We were opposed to separatism of every kind. That included racial separatism that was being put forth during the same period by Black nationalists. And also, we did not subscribe to lesbian separatism, which was something that white women, primarily white women, although a few women of color, had developed. They believed that all the problems on the globe were because there were people who could be identified as male at birth. In other words, they believed that patriarchy was the first cause. And their solution for that is like, we're not going to deal with these people. No, we are not dealing with these people. We are going to, get our own land. We're going to not allow them to come to concerts or to come to places where women are. There's a really legitimate reason to have internal discussions amongst people with whom you share an experience. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but it's very challenging to build a politic on that, particularly when you live in the United States, the belly of the beast, and you're living under a system of racial capitalism, xenophobia, ableism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, the list goes on. How do you build a movement when you only see one vector of systematic oppression? I'm going to read to you now from, I'm going to hold up this book. This is Homegirls, a Black feminist anthology, and I'm holding it up higher so that you can see perhaps round seal circle in the corner that indicates it's the 40th anniversary edition. Really nice. Came out in 2023. This is, of course, my book, Homegirls, a Black Feminist Anthology. And this is the preface to the 40th anniversary edition. As I told my friends and perhaps my editor, I said, I'm never going to write anything about homegirls again. This is it, because I had written a new preface in 2000 when Rutgers University Press brought it out. And of course, I had written the original introduction that goes on for many pages. And I just thought I'm kind of played out with talking about homegirls now. But I did, accept the challenge one more time. And this is from, excuse me, this is from the newer preface to the 40th anniversary edition. And it is about identity politics. As far as we have been able to determine, the Combahee River Statement was the original source of the phrase identity politics. What we meant by this concept, which has become highly contested, is that Black women have a right to define and organize their own political agendas based on their intersecting identities and experiences of oppression. We needed to state this explicitly at a time when the common assumption in feminist and Black liberation movements was that all the women were white and all the Blacks were men. We use the term identity politics to provide a rationale for why it was legitimate to address race and gender simultaneously, as well as class and sexuality. Asserting our right to address the complexities of our political position never stopped us from working in coalition with individuals and groups from various backgrounds, because we actually believed in struggle. Some of us had revolutionary consciousness. We knew that all of us together had to make that we could not do it in sectors. We have to be able, and you know that today. That's why you're in the Socialist Majority Caucus and in DSA. You understand that. I don't have to explain it. Thank you. Expectedly, the right wing is repulsed by identity politics, although the idea of what it is has nothing to do with what we originally expressed. What is more disturbing is that a lot of people on the left also attack identity politics and are similarly unaware of the source of the term or what anti-capitalist Black women actually meant by it. A major criticism of identity politics from the left is that it ignores class oppression completely. Given how identity politics has been distorted and used to justify siloed and insular approaches to grappling with injustice, I understand why some people believe that it had a mostly negative impact on contemporary political culture and movements. I think that one of the reasons that identity politics has been so distorted is because a lot of people are introduced to it in the context of the college or the university classroom. So the people who are introducing the concept to them probably are maybe are most likely have never been involved in political organizing. And they understand identity politics just as a kind of intellectual kind of thing. So the way that the people that they convey this to, they may be reading the Combahee River Collective statement, they probably are, and other stuff, but their understanding of it is like you, like you divide or substrate or whatever that is, like you take every single little element of who you are, you describe those that list of who you are, and then the conclusion you come to is like, I can't work with, talk to, learn from, or be with anybody who's not exactly like me. And therein lies the status quo. It just stays completely the same. That is what Assad Haider and Olufemi write about in their books that you were asked to read parts of Mistaken Identity and Elite Capture, the distortion, because each of them, to their great credit, and these are leftists, each of them to their credit, cites the Combahee River Collective and makes the distinction between what people say identity politics is and what it actually is. I'm going to read to you an example of false consciousness, one of my favorite concepts, just to show you like how this is not so much about identity politics. It might say something about identity politics, but it shows like the debasement of the politics that we are talking about today. This is again from Kianga's new introduction to How We Get Free. The full title of that book is How We Get Free, Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective. She worked on the book originally so that it would come out on the year of the 40th anniversary of the Combahee River Collective Statement. So it came out in 2017. So Kianga writes, and you can imagine how I felt when I read this. It's like, oh, okay, where is this guy? And of course, I knew who the guy was. I think he might be fairly close by. But this is what he had to say. In a 2021 article, political scientist Adolph Reed Jr. described the revived interest in the Combahee River Collective as a regrettable example of the left's, quote, quest for Moses says, that is Moses like in the Bible, which he described as the shorthand branding exercise of privileging the content of individual characters in our debates on racial justice. Reed derides the collective as, quote, a touchstone of identitarian righteousness, end quote, adding, quote, the Combahee River Collective, never much more than a book club that issued statements in the late 1970s, has now been lauded repeatedly as a font of an important post-1960s Black radical sensibility and canonized as a model for us today. I mean, talk about trash. I guess he didn't really read that far, in the Combahee River Collective Statement, because one of the sections of the statement is about our agenda for organizing. Organizing we may have already done at the time that we wrote the statement, and organizing we were looking forward to doing. If he had read a little bit farther, and of course he's a big scholar, unlike certain people, if he read a little bit further, he would have found out about what happened in 1979 in Boston. That's where the Combahee River Collective was based, of course. And what happened in 1979 is that ultimately, in the period from January to May or early June of 1979, 12 Black women were murdered. 12. And they were murdered in most of, or if not all of the predominantly people of color neighborhoods in Boston. And Combahee was at the center of organizing the entire city around those murders, which, when they began, were originally reported. The first two murders, where the bodies of the teenagers were found in garbage bags dumped at the on the site of the Stride Right Shoe Factory. Yes, that news was put in on the page of the Boston Globe, where the racing results were reported. So that's how little it was. There's a person whose name I won't be able to say because I didn't, I just thought of it, but no, Mike Barnacle, that's who it was. Mike Barnacle, a well-known journalist, was writing for the Globe at that time, and he said that 12 Black women being murdered, that's not news. And we did not care for all of that. We worked night and day, organizing. And one of the things we did was to write a pamphlet, and we explained to people who might not have known about that what violence against women was. We had a list of ways that you could do self-protection. We listed organizations. We translated it into Spanish, and eventually we distributed 40,000 copies of it. That's hand to hand. So yeah, we were a book club, all right. Yeah, we love books. We talked about them all the time, and that's true. We are talking about the Bluest Eye and Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and the few Black lesbian writers we could find. Yeah, we love books. Some of us are actually trying to write, but we were not a book club. But the contempt of a living Black academic is just, it's just stunning. And I'm really glad that Kianga brought that out. I'm going to read all my notes and try not to digress because I see that our time is getting short. I think the most unique contribution of the Combahee River Collective statement written in 1977 is that we publicly asserted that we were opposed to the dehumanization, bigotry, violence, and criminalization that we and many others experience because of sexual orientation. These are terms that were used at the time. In other words, we spoke out against homophobia. Note that we talk in the statement about heterosexual oppression, because when we wrote the statement, the terms heterosexism and homophobia did not exist. That in and of itself is an indication of how groundbreaking Combahee's statement and political practice were. I always maintain that the reason the Combahee River Collective Statement is still relevant and useful to this day is because it was written from a socialist perspective. It is explicitly anti-capitalist and grounded in a material understanding of Black women's lives. Despite the continuing accusations, we were not primarily focused on identity as the most important means to bring about fundamental political change. We understood that oppression was systemic, that white supremacy, misogyny, and compulsory heterosexuality served the economic interests of the ruling class. We staunchly believed in working in coalitions and did just that. To this day, there is very little available history of Black feminism, the feminism of women of color, the history of lesbian feminism, anti-racist feminism, which nobody even believes ever existed, and socialist feminism. I already read Adolph Reed's misguided comment. I'm going to digress again because I'm me. And if you want to find out about the history, just hang on for a couple of years because my papers are now at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard. and it's going to take at least 2 years to process them because 165 boxes, it's actually 166. I think that they decided to say it was 165 because that's a more round number, but 166 boxes went from where I live, right here, from my garage. They were put on a truck in October. The papers are there, and we are very well aware that when those papers become accessible to researchers, that I believe that they will transform understandings of the historical period that they cover, because there is so little available about, particularly in primary documents, about what that was history was all about. How was Combahee received? Outside of the leftist women's movement, not very cordially. My lifelong friend, Demeter Fraser, who lived in Boston for many years after Combahee disbanded, tells me that when she has talked to Black women about why they did not want to get involved with Combahee, they say it was not because we were lesbians, but because we were socialists. I mean, just imagine. We talk about that all the time, Demeter and I, because we're in constant contact with each other. And we have been recorded together. It's quite an experience when we're all together. But anyway, she said that's what they said. It wasn't that you were lesbians, that you're these reds, you were these commies. Okay, right on, and that's just the way that's going to be. We are persona non grata in many places, including in the women's movement, where we faced racism and elitism. We often felt we couldn't win for losing. I've been told fairly recently that there are people who taught in women's studies at the University at Albany, the major university in our location, who were so furious and so nasty, about me I wasn't trying to get a job there, but like whatever it was they were talking about, they just had nothing but disdain and nothing but negativity about me. And I do believe it's because I actually brought up racism every so often, and they didn't want to be shown out as for what they were. We experienced racism in the women's movement, and yet we stood strong about the need to build a multi-racial socialist feminist left women's movement for all people. And also our politics extended to our solidarity with many different kinds of groups, including, in my case, our Black gay male brothers. We were not really talking about our relationships with our trans siblings then, because that political analysis had not been developed at the time that we were doing our major work. But I will let you know, in most cases, and this includes my comrades from the movement during that era, most of my comrades from that time, we are absolutely clear about trans women being women, and that everybody has a right to self-identify as they wish, to define their own lives. I mean, how stupid would we look? We said, well, I can do that, but you can't. I was crazy. But it's always refreshing, that to see, after sometimes, of course, you don't speak to someone for a long time, and then you catch up, and then you talk about things that are happening, and you find out, oh yeah, our politics are our politics. I mean, I'm not saying we're perfect. I just say there's just certain things that we're not gonna do. The advent of intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw is a legal scholar, as you know, who is working on a case brought by Black women against their workplace because they were consistently being passed over for better jobs and promotions at a particular workplace. The judge's response was that they had no case because the business employed women and Black people who did have access to mobility in their job titles and pay. What was obvious, however, that it was only white women and Black men who got these opportunities. Kimberly arrived at a legal theory that Black women were being discriminated against because of their intersecting race and gender identities and status, and were structurally blocked from advancement. Kimberly has publicly acknowledged that her thinking about intersectionality has its roots in the Combahee River Collective Statement. Intersectionality has now become a buzzword similar to multiculturalism, diversity, etc. We are organizing this pizza party with an intersectional lens. Really? Oh, so you're going to get 3 kinds of pizza instead of one. Okay. Oh, yes, that group is very intersectional, which might mean they have one person of color who drops by occasionally. The last question I have that we will not get into, that I think is a really good one for us to end on, is what, if anything, do these politics have to do with what US fascism writ large looks like? And I believe, as do some others, that the reason there's such a reaction going on at this time is that all the things that we asserted accomplished. And I'm not just talking about people in comedy or Black feminists or queer women. I'm just talking about all of those who said there are a few things missing. This thing called democracy. Let's see what we can do to alter that. Even things like voting rights, because the Supreme Court may very well strike down the last part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that is Section 2, that would give the Voting Rights Act any ability for people that people could use it to ensure fair voting practices. But all these things that we accomplished generationally in my lifetime, although I would probably kind of track it from before my birth in the early 20th century until this point, all the things that we accomplished around justice, liberation, making this a more legitimate democracy. It has yet to ever achieve that. We're not a legitimate democracy. We weren't a legitimate democracy before the TRUMP era. But all those things that we accomplished, they're reacting to those because they know their days are numbered. They know they can read, the demographic data just like we can, which shows that just a few years from now, by the mid 21st century, people from the global majority who live in the United States will be the majority of people living in the United States. And that people of European heritage will no longer be the majority numerically in the United States. That causes them stress and anxiety because they probably believe that once the numbers, alter, and that means power gets altered, particularly if you're talking about a conventional electoral situation of congressional districts, etc. Once that alters, I'm sure they believe that certain people will treat them the way we have always been treated. I don't think we're even studying them. We are not thinking about them. All we want to do is just have some peace in our own lifetimes and be able to take care of ourselves and of our loved ones. But because they have the ultimate false consciousness, they think that if the tables turn based upon demographic numbers, that they will be in trouble. And therefore, they're going to do everything possible to take the word trans off of the National Stonewall Monument, take down the rainbow flag of the Stonewall Monument, remove the pictures of a famous picture of a Black person whose back looks like it's corrugated from all the beatings that person received. It's a very famous picture. They've taken it down because they don't want people to know that stuff. They want to erase Black studies, women's studies. They're going against or going after the universities because it's in universities often where this information gets communicated. Of course, they want to colonize Gaza and eradicate the Palestinian population. They have a very ugly agenda, but our politics are the opposite of that. And Black feminism, as you know, is for everyone. So it's a big job, but that's where we are. And I look forward to our breaking into small groups.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for sharing so much like insight into the history of the document and your life and the organizing work that came into it and the context. And um, I guess, do we want to jump immediately into breakouts, or do we want to give folks an opportunity for a little bit of like question and answer whole group?
Sure, we can do that. I'll be happy. That's my favorite part of any presentation, the
Awesome.
part where people comment and I get to interact and not worry.
So to give folks an idea of the roadmap, we do have some breakout groups planned around talking about intersectional campaigns or making DSA more intersectional. But before we dig into that, yeah, any questions on the readings or responses to Barbara's um, lecture? Yeah, Pedro.
Yeah, so I wanted to speak a little bit about I guess the previous organization before the collective was formed. That was something that wasn't like super duper, at least to me, and maybe I didn't read it quite deeply. But on the statement, I didn't quite get the reason why the formation of the collective, why that was such an intentional decision. I felt like I kind of got some hints from it, but definitely I really appreciate the clarification during this talk. And it kind of, it was just a really interesting piece of history as to say, oh well, there's already this organization. Why feel the need to splinter off? And there was definitely a rationale, and the statement is definitely a really good kind of gist as to why as well.
Thank you. And of course, as you know, Pedro, it's because we had different politics. We had a different political analysis and agenda, so that's why. We built, people who were in Combahee had helped to build NBFO, so it wasn't like a hostile situation, but we just had different politics.
But yeah, just really striking to see. I mean, it was enough of a difference to say, hey, we need to, like, it's necessary. And so just want to thank you for the clarification on that for sure.
Thanks, Pedro. Mary Jo?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barbara. My heart and brain are full. Thank you so much. You were so incredibly generous with sharing your thoughts and experiences. It means a lot. I wanted to see if you could speak a little bit to a couple of concepts at least in the other pieces we read, the whole elite capture idea, and I think underlying both of those pieces, and the one that I just sadly discovered the author of the other one has passed away very recently. I just was horrified. But the sort of assumption that it's going to take praxis and constructivism based in a vision and commitment to liberation of all people to build what we need to build. I just wondered if you had some thoughts on those moving forwards or moving sideways from what you all have anchored. Thank you.
Well, what Olufemi writes about is how people use identity politics, people empower people with privilege to kind of fool people into thinking that they're doing something to help those who have less privilege. But in reality, it's very cynical that they're just using the terminology or the concept and basically maintaining the status quo. And I think that Assad Haider basically does the same thing or something very similar, which is to say that if you don't look at the history of like race, and race in particular, because he says I'm going to focus mostly on race, but if you don't look at that and build a politic out of that, then you're not going to get anywhere either. And he talks about Black nationalism and Black separatism, and he talks about the Black Panther Party as being a kind of role model of the kind of inclusive politics, all hands, on deck politics that will get us to the next stage. So, like that's, people, they do all kinds of things to hold on to power and to distort identity politics the way that it has been distorted. You can all, if you look at social media, look at websites, that are news websites, watch, the, you know, I don't know what word to use, the watered down kinds of coverage that you get on MSNBC and CNN. But it's, it's something. They have big reporting staffs. You will find out what just happened by looking at things like that and looking at the New York Times. You'll see the term identity politics virtually every day, see or hear it, and it will almost never, I've never heard it being used accurately, ever, in any mainstream context. So I hope that answers your question. And certainly, feel free, like in our signal chat, if you want more elaboration about any of the things we talked about, please use it for that.
Thank you.
Looks like we have Christina and then Vincent.
Hi, Barbara. While we're talking about the elite capture of it all, I would be curious to hear your thoughts and advice on how to handle the hijacking. Like, there's this theory or this saying, it could be ignorance or malice. When, and to me, I'm a little bit like, it kind of doesn't matter if it's ignorance or malice when we have this big project of organizing. So I just wonder, like, what you think the balance might be around the changing of hearts and minds and also this capturing and hijacking of this very important organizing principle.
Well, I guess what I would say is that I'm not so fixated on the distortion of identity politics as I am on the much more ongoing and long-lived phenomenon of people whose class interests are counter to those of most people, of most working people, using whatever mechanism they can to stop organizing in its tracks. So, like, even though identity politics, as it was originally articulated, is very useful for our political organizing, I don't think we should get stuck on we need to rescue identity politics to the exclusion of just continuing to do the work. I think that having an analysis, and that's what our study sessions, our study series, that's what it's about. It's like honing and expanding our capacity to analyze what we see before us, and being able, and therefore being able to do that, to come up with ideas and solutions for how to address what we see before us. Like, for example, the fact that there's something called ICE that is staging warfare in many U.S. cities, theoretically, or in fact, not theoretically, they say that what they're trying to do is to get rid of people who are here illegally. But the other project that is to destabilize people's sense of what they are allowed to do, where they're allowed to be, and how safe they are. So, as I said, it's more important for us to have a solid way of understanding the political realities in which we are immersed than it is, I think, to figure out how can we get everybody to understand that identity politics is terrific. I mean, that's not, for me, that I'm not that concerned about the latter. I think it's good that you are. But do you see the distinction I'm making? There've always been ways of getting people, like, look over here, look over here. In the meantime, over there, if you look over there or look in front of you, you see what's really happening. Perfect example is like how racism has been used in this country to divide people and divide the working class. In the South, in particular, white people who did not have many rights, couldn't necessarily own land, etc., etc. They were given the false, sense that you're better than those other people who have more melanin, who come from the African continent versus you from the European, continent, whatever. I mean, and therefore you align, we want you to align with us, the white ruling class, the planter class. We want you to align with us based on what? Skin color. The unscientific, reality that people adapt to environments and that you can see what environments they adapted to by features. Black hair different from white hair. What do you think that's about? That's about living in one of the hottest climates on the globe. And if you have like hair that is very compact, closely coiled, etc., you're better out in the elements. You don't necessarily have to wear a hat, all the time. If you see what I'm saying. So all these things that people think are definitive about the quality of the human being, it's nothing. But we have a whole nation state that has been organized based upon so-called racial differences and racial superiority. So as I said, for me, it's like there are always bad ideas being thrown at the masses to get them to stay still. Another way that another way that works is through violence. We've had the violence in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. We had COINTELPRO. We had the murders of Panthers, including Fred Hampton in Chicago, who believed he was the first person. Jesse Jackson just died. And yes, indeed, he did promote and believe in a rainbow coalition. But before Jesse Jackson, there was Fred Hampton and the Panthers in Chicago. And what did they do to Fred Hampton? So there's always this intimidation, all the different things.
Christina, did you?
I would like us to break into small groups. So I don't know how many people have their hands up besides Jenna, but
I
I
think
just
there's
wanted to
just
let
two
you
more,
know.
so we'll try to go
Okay,
quick through
great,
those and then go into
great.
breakouts. So
That's
Jana
great.
and then Daniela.
Hi, I know we're trying to move to breakouts, and so my question is not that small. I'm sorry, but so I think folks here on the call might know I'm Jana. I'm the co-chair of the DSA's International Committee. I live in Brazil, and so I get a lot of have gotten a lot of questions since 2020s, obviously about our partners here in Brazil and in other countries being like Black Lives Matter, what's going on, what happened to that movement, right? And obviously I have a certain reading that it kind of got, sort of diverted into the Biden electoral campaign. But I really would be very curious to know, Barbara, your kind of reading of the situation. Like, we had that sort of, almost incredible, sort of evolution of, activism, that was multiracial, inclusive, for Black liberation and against police brutality, et cetera. And then, just kind of died down and just kind of curious as also to get a message that I can also bring to our international partners that ask about this kind of where is the movement for Black liberation now? How is it connected? To the ongoing, key struggle against ICE and for the liberation of our immigrant brothers and sisters as well. So I know, again, not a small question, but if you could give a few
Not
sort
at
of
all.
comments.
And a very valuable question. Not small, but also very valuable. I would not presume to be able to answer that with any kind of definitiveness. I certainly have heard that after the outpouring during the election year 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, that people were encouraged to get involved in the campaign, the presidential campaign, so that we didn't have to deal with another TRUMP presidency. And, we see how that worked out. We had a president and a vice president and a whole administration that let a genocide unfold in real time and also funded that genocide and is still funding the genocide, which, despite there supposedly being a ceasefire, has not ended. The genocide against the Palestinian people does continue, both in Gaza and the West Bank. But in any event, the formation of Black Lives Matter, I think in some ways it was different from other chapters and other kinds of ways of organizing in the US Black diaspora. It was decentralized, and I feel like that thing about an analysis, that I'm so like kind of wedded to and believe in so strongly. I'm not sure that the Black Lives Matter had a shared analysis across the board of which way forward under various kinds of circumstances that could help them to avoid a certain pitfalls. There is still Black Lives Matter organizing in the United States, but it's not as visible. But just so that we can not be depressed or pessimistic, many people, particularly given that it's the very same geographic location, many people see the incredible, stalwart, courageous, tenacious organizing in Minneapolis in the face of government ordered brutality against the populace. They see that as the next chapter of the organizing that happened around George Floyd, particularly within the Twin Cities, if you see what I'm saying. So that the reason they have come out so strong in the last few months is because they had the experience of dealing with that lynching in real time, and that the connections that were made during that earlier atrocity, still obtains. No organizing that's solid is ever wasted. It always helps you to the next stage and the next piece of organizing. But that's a longer discussion, and I'm very happy to have a conversation with you about it. And there are probably some articles and things about it too to look at.
Thanks.
Okay, I think we do have time for one more question, Daniela, and then we'll go into breakout groups.
Okay, thank you. Even with all this time, I've been listening so hard, I haven't been able to formulate my question that well. But I I don't know, because this is a very DSA specific question. I think one thing that I've just seen in the context of DSA that I can really struggle with in terms of identity politics is just like the reflexive backsliding into kind of this nonprofit mindset of like providing services to people as opposed to being in community with them, or like working collaboratively, or at least like in my chapter I can see like a lot of times it's speaking for groups of people instead of like engaging them as leaders or engaging them, and there can be resistance to coalition if people we don't think are as politically developed as they could be. So I think it's just like what are ways to relate, what are ways to help and sort of facilitate a culture in DSA that recognize like that moves towards solidarity as opposed to like how do you teach solidarity in the context of DSA? I've seen this happen in labor because you have a very clear, it's a lot easier to happen in labor environments because you have a very clear target in my experience, but in DSA it can be harder.
You will see that in some ways both of the questions for our for our breakout groups address that very thing that you just raised, I believe. That's what I thought would be great for us to talk about. So yeah, I have nothing I have nothing smart to say at this point, but that's yeah, I think that that's what I wanted people to be talking about when you come into groups together. One of the questions specifically focuses on DSA. That not-for-profit model that has done a real job to movements in our country. People ask, where did Combahee get its funding from? We had no funding. We didn't have a building. We didn't have an executive director. We had no staff. We had no budget. Those pamphlets that I told you about that we did in response to the murders, they were funded. They to begin with, they were just photocopied at a copy shop like people used to do. But we collect because we were working in solidarity with other people. We were able to raise funds ourselves, and then also eventually, there were several organizations that formed in relationship to the murders. One of them was the support group for women's safety. That was something that my sister Beverly was instrumental in. I remember that was a meeting of that first meeting of that group. She went to that and was leadership in that, and I didn't even go to that one. We had a support group for women's safety. We had a coalition for women's safety. We had a lot of things, and excuse me, through that money was raised, for the things that we needed, and eventually we had a typeset printed version of the pamphlet that was printed by a professional movement printer. But we didn't really need much money. All of us could cook. I'm so sorry to be hoarse. I'm going to say it forever. I hate this, but all of us could cook. We always had food at our meetings. I mean, there was no question that we would have food, and much of it was was homemade. And we, we just did the things that we needed to do. I mean, and then, it was nothing was elaborate. We did organize count them, 7 separate Black feminist retreats from 1977 until 1980 or so. Yeah, we did do that. How did we do that? We would ask people who had big houses to vacate their house for the weekend so that we could all stay in their house and or find other houses in the community where people could stay. We weren't about, nobody was staying in a hotel. And again, the food was to die for. You can't even imagine the menus that we had because, another thing about Demita Beverly is that we can throw down, we can cook. And so could almost all Black women of my age group can do that. So we did not lack, for the things we basically need. And we would have literature tables at our retreats. There were no books to speak of. There are very few books. So if we wanted somebody who came from another place to read an article, we found out how many people are coming, how many photocopies do we need to make. Just, like that. I really want us to go into these groups because I worked hard on these questions. Okay, that's me being like OCD. So
Yeah, let's
just
get
let
into
me
it
be
then.
OCD.
Thank you, Danielle, for that question. I think it's like like Barbara was saying, is the perfect bridge to these conversations that we're asking folks to have. So we have about 28 minutes left in our time. So I'll create these groups. You can choose which of the 2 questions you want to discuss, and we'll spend about 22-ish minutes in the group and then come back together to close out. So if there's like 4 or 5 people in one of the groups and you want to be in a group for that section, we'll try to have 2 groups for that question. And as Barbara mentioned, the two questions that she came up with are thinking about the political issues or campaigns you're currently working on. How might you incorporate a more intersectional approach into the organizing? If you're already engaged in intersectional organizing, what are you doing? What works? What doesn't? So really focusing on the campaign. And then the second question is thinking more about DSA as an organization and how we can make our organization more diverse and inclusive, including things that we've learned about and discussed today or done readings on. So I'm going to open up the rooms. You will get to select your own room. If you need help getting into a room, just let me know. I'll stay here and I'll put you in the room relevant to the question that you want to be in.
And do you want me to put the questions into the chat?
I did already, but
Oh, good. Okay,
yeah.
I'm glad. Yeah, I wasn't seeing. I'm so behind in where I am in the chat
No worries at all.
because of presenting. Yes, thank you.
All right, so you should be able to select the breakout group. It should pop up in a box for you, and I'm going to pause the recording too.